Close your eyes, think back, and imagine the 1960s. Giant studio logos, prestige casts, and war epics that were supposed to conquer the box office, and instead, quietly crashed. Some of these movies had Oscar buzz, legendary stars, and marketing campaigns that promised the next great war classic. But when the lights came up and the early ticket reports came in, the numbers were brutal. Today, we're diving into 10 of vintage Hollywood's most striking war movie misfires from the 1960s. How they went wrong, why some of them were way ahead of their time, and which of these so-called flops might actually deserve a second look. We're starting with a film that even many James Stewart fans have never seen, and that alone tells you something. The Mountain Road drops us into World War II China, where Stewart plays Major Baldwin, a weary American officer ordered to slow the enemy advance by destroying roads, bridges, and warehouses. On paper, it's a straightforward wartime assignment. In practice, it turns into a moral disaster. Instead of the usual gung-ho heroics, the film shows American troops blowing up the very infrastructure that local civilians rely on, straining relationships with the Chinese allies they're supposed to be helping. There's no triumphant march, no neat victory, just dust, wreckage, and civilians looking at the good guys with a mix of fear and resentment. One historian even points out that it's one of the first Hollywood war films to tackle U.S. Army abuses head-on, framing them as abuse of power rather than noble sacrifice. Audiences in 1960 were not ready for that. Stewart himself later admitted he considered it one of the best scripts he'd ever read, but he was shocked when it turned into a box office failure. People walking in expecting another uplifting Stewart vehicle were met with something much harsher. A film that basically said, "Your side did ugly things too." The result? The Mountain Road faded fast. But looking back, it feels like a preview of the darker, more critical war movies that wouldn't become mainstream until years later. And if this was the warm-up, Hollywood absolutely wasn't done betting big on serious war stories that didn't land. But Hollywood still believed there was an audience for complex war stories, especially if a major star was attached. That leads us to a very long, very heavy espionage thriller that quietly slipped through the cracks. Next up is The Counterfeit Traitor, a film that tried to serve audiences a morally tangled spy story instead of a simple tale of heroism. Based on a non-fiction book, it stars William Holden as Eric Eriksson, a Swedish-American oil trader who gets blacklisted and then pressured by Allied intelligence into infiltrating Nazi Germany. Rather than turning him into a smooth, wisecracking agent, the film leans into the stress. Eriksson isn't a natural hero. He's a businessman dragged into something terrifying. He has to pretend to sympathize with the regime just to survive, and the film forces him into ugly choices. Who do you deceive? What do you sacrifice? How much of your old life can you keep? That approach made The Counterfeit Traitor feel intense and grown up, but it also made it a tough sell. At around 140 minutes, it moves slowly, with long stretches of tension and emotional strain instead of constant action. At the box office, that didn't pay off. Rentals in the US and Canada were modest for a star of Holden's stature, and industry observers noted that it never became the kind of hit Paramount was clearly hoping for. In the era of big, colorful war spectacles, The Counterfeit Traitor was grim, talky, and morally complicated. It's the kind of film that might have thrived later on cable or streaming, when viewers are more willing to sit through slow-burn thrillers, but in 1962, it just couldn't compete. And if you think that sounds rough, imagine what happens when you add Marlon Brando, a huge budget, and a marketing plan that misfires so badly the studio literally changes the film's title to try again. Morituri is one of those movies that looks bulletproof on paper. You've got Marlon Brando at the height of his fame, Yul Brynner as co-lead, a tense World War II premise about a pacifist forced to sabotage a Nazi-controlled cargo ship, and moody black and white photography from a top cinematographer. The story is all about chess moves and mind games. Brando's character, posing as an officer, has to quietly disable scuttling charges before Allied forces move in, all while the suspicious captain is losing faith in the war itself. Critics actually liked a lot about it. Reviews praised the performances and the atmosphere, but audiences? They just didn't show up. Studio records tell the harsh truth. Morituri cost about $6.29 million to make and earned only around $3 million in rentals. It needed roughly $10.5 million just to break even and wound up bringing in about $4 million total, making it a clear financial disaster. The studio panicked. In an attempt to rebrand the movie as more of a high-octane thriller, they reissued it under a new title, Saboteur, codename Morituri, hoping that audiences had missed it the first time around and would be tricked into giving it another chance. They weren't. The film still sank, and today it's mostly remembered in box office histories as one of Brando's notorious 60s flops. If Morituri shows how even A-list names couldn't guarantee success, our next film proves that not even Frank Sinatra could turn a thoughtful anti-war story into a hit. None But the Brave is a fascinating what-if in Frank Sinatra's career. It's the only film he ever directed, and it's set in the Pacific Theater during World War II. An American patrol and a Japanese platoon both end up stranded on the same tiny island. Instead of one side eliminating the other, they slowly realize that if they don't cooperate, they all starve. For a mid-60s studio film, its message is surprisingly bold. It shows both American Marines and Japanese soldiers as scared, stubborn, and human. They share resources, haggle over territory, and even form fragile friendships until the wider war inevitably crashes back into their fragile peace. It's not the rah-rah patriotism many viewers expected from Sinatra. It's closer to the later wave of late 60s and 70s anti-war cinema. Financially, however, it just didn't connect. With a reported budget of around $4 million and only about $2.5 million in North American rentals, it failed to recoup its costs in its initial run. Some accounts even suggest that in Sinatra's inner circle, the film was looked back on as a costly misstep. Over time, critics have started to reassess None But the Brave as an underrated early anti-war piece, especially as more information surfaced about its complex US-Japan co-production history. But in the 1960s box office column, it sits firmly in the disappointment category. If that wasn't tricky enough, the next film tried to blend war, politics, and a serial crime mystery, and the result baffled nearly everybody. The Night of the Generals might be one of the strangest war movies of the 1960s. On the surface, it's set firmly in World War II, occupied Warsaw, Nazi officers, and the shadow of the Eastern Front. But the core of the film is a grim investigation into a series of horrific crimes committed in the city, with the main suspects all being high-ranking generals. Peter O'Toole turns in a chilling performance as one of those officers, a figure who feels more like a monster from a psychological thriller than a typical war movie villain. Omar Sharif plays the investigator, piecing together clues across years with the famous 20th July plot against the leadership woven into the story. It's stylish, moody, and morally bleak. But how do you sell that to a mainstream audience? The studio marketed it as a prestigious war drama, but once people sat down, they found a slow, talky murder investigation set against a brutal wartime backdrop. In the US and Canada, it only managed modest rentals despite the big names. It never grew into the kind of hit its cast list suggested. Today, film buffs treat The Night of the Generals as an odd curiosity, too dark for casual wartime nostalgia, too war-soaked to be shelved alongside conventional thrillers. It sits right at that crossroads where marketing, genre, and audience expectations simply didn't line up. But if you want to see a film that went even further in rejecting conventional heroics, our next entry does exactly that and paid for it at the box office. Carl Foreman's The Victors feels like the 1960s war film that tried to say everything at once. Based on the novel The Humankind, it follows a group of American soldiers from their arrival in Britain all the way through Italy, France, and into occupied Berlin. But instead of giving each character a clean arc, it presents the war as a series of bleak episodes, love affairs that go nowhere, acts of cruelty, quiet moments of numbness. Shot in stark black and white and running well over 2 hours in its original cut, it features a surprising cast: George Peppard, Eli Wallach, Jean Moreau, and more yet deliberately resists giving audiences a central hero to cling to. One of its most infamous scenes shows a holiday execution set against cheerful seasonal music, a tonal clash that hammers home the film's point that there's no tidy way to package war. Critics admired its ambition, but regular moviegoers were a different story. In the North American market, it pulled in disappointing rentals for a production of its scale. For a prestige war picture, it was a letdown. Eventually, the film was cut down for later releases, as if trimming the running time could somehow fix the fact that it left audiences shaken rather than uplifted. In hindsight, The Victors looks like an early attempt at the kind of anti-war epic that would later become revered. But in its own decade, it was simply another reminder that serious, downbeat war stories were a hard sell. Of course, studios didn't just gamble on soldiers, they also tried to turn revolutionary icons into box office gold, and one of those attempts exploded in their faces. You can almost picture the pitch meeting for Che, We've got Omar Sharif to play Che Guevara, Jack Palance as Fidel, a big canvas of guerrilla warfare and global politics. How could this possibly fail? The finished film follows Che from the Cuban campaign through his final push in Bolivia, but instead of a complex exploration of ideology and strategy, the movie offers a heavily simplified, romanticized retelling. Contemporary critics and later reviewers slammed it for flattening real events into a conventional heroic arc while still somehow managing to alienate viewers on all sides of the political spectrum. Some modern commentators simply call it a real disaster, boring and misguided rather than thrilling or insightful. Financially, the result was brutal. The studio's own numbers suggest the film lost millions in rentals, marking it as one of their major late 60s flops. Articles looking back on Omar Sharif's career even note that Che damaged his image after the high of Lawrence of Arabia and other hits, turning what should have been another prestige moment into a cautionary tale. Today, Che is mostly remembered as an example of how not to handle volatile history on screen. It reminds us that timing, nuance, and audience mood matter just as much as casting and subject matter. And if you think that's a case of the right idea presented in the wrong way, the next film is a perfect example of the right story landing at exactly the wrong time. Sidney Lumet's Failsafe is one of those movies that feels eerily modern. A technical malfunction sends a squadron of American bombers racing toward the Soviet Union with orders that can't be recalled. Leaders on both sides scramble to fix the situation before it turns into full-scale catastrophe. There are no jokes, no flashy action sequences, just tense conversations, phone calls, and impossible moral decisions. Critics loved it. Reviewers praised its tight direction, intense performances, and willingness to stare directly into the nightmare scenario of accidental nuclear conflict. It was widely acknowledged as a serious, intelligent piece of Cold War cinema. So, what went wrong? Timing. Earlier that same year, another film tackled almost the exact same premise: world-ending escalation triggered by human error and rigid systems. But that one was framed as a dark comedy, Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove. Kubrick got there first, and audiences had already processed the terror of nuclear miscalculation through satire. By the time Failsafe arrived, asking people to sit through a sober version of essentially the same nightmare, many viewers just couldn't bring themselves to do it. The result was a painful contradiction. A film that handles its material brilliantly, yet couldn't draw crowds. Decades later, Failsafe has gained respect through home viewing and even a live TV remake. But at the time, it was another reminder that being good doesn't always mean being successful. And if you want to see that pattern play out on an even bigger scale with exotic locations, a worn-down star, and a studio counting every dollar, you only have to look at the Sand Pebbles. On the surface, the Sand Pebbles looked like exactly the kind of prestige project that should have dominated award season and the box office. Steve McQueen, one of the biggest stars of the era, plays Jake Holman, an engineer stationed on a U.S. Navy gunboat patrolling a river in the 1920s China. The film explores imperial tension, cultural clashes, and the emotional toll of being a foreign power in a country on the brink. Behind the scenes, the production was grueling. Shooting in Taiwan and Hong Kong stretched on for months, with McQueen reportedly so exhausted by the end that he stepped away from film work for about a year afterward. On screen, the film is long, heavy, and deliberately downbeat. It doesn't offer easy heroics. It emphasizes futility and unintended consequences. Financially, it came very close, but not quite close enough. Internal records show that the Sand Pebbles needed just over $21 million in rentals to break even and brought in slightly less than that by the end of its initial run. That left the studio recording a significant loss. For a major epic with multiple Oscar nominations, falling just short of profitability still counted as a painful miss. Over time, though, its reputation has improved. Many now consider it one of McQueen's finest performances and a powerful critique of foreign intervention. It's a classic case where the ledger and the legacy don't quite align. But our final film might be the clearest example of this entire pattern: a huge, technically impressive war epic that drew crowds, lost money anyway, and only later earned the respect of aviation fans around the world. By the end of the decade, the war epic arms race peaked with Battle of Britain. This film set out to recreate the 1940 air campaign in painstaking detail: real aircraft, large-scale aerial formations, and an enormous cast of British stars, from Michael Caine and Laurence Olivier to Christopher Plummer and more. It absolutely delivered on spectacle. The flying sequences are still praised today for their realism, with carefully choreographed dogfights shot using actual period aircraft. But as with so many ambitious projects, the budget spiraled. Estimates put the cost at around $14 million, huge money for 1969, and by the time all the bills were paid, later accounts suggest the film ultimately lost around $10 million, despite grossing just under $13 million worldwide. Why didn't it work? A lot of critics argued that the film had too many characters and not enough emotional focus. Viewers got stunning aerial sequences but struggled to care deeply about any one pilot or commander. Some critics even listed it among the year's biggest disasters, calling it a prime example of spectacle without story. And yet, like so many titles on this list, Battle of Britain slowly found its place. On television, on home media, and in aviation circles, it became a go-to reference for old-school air combat on screen. The very thing that made it financially risky, its obsessive attention to aircraft and tactics, is exactly what gives it staying power today. Looking back at these 10 films, a pattern jumps out. In the 1960s, studios kept trying to evolve the war movie. More morally complex, more critical, more politically charged, more technically ambitious. But audiences weren't always ready to follow. The Mountain Road and The Victors showed a side of Allied actions that viewers didn't want to confront. Fail Safe arrived just after a satirical masterpiece had already covered similar ground. The Unknown but the Brave tried to humanize people and conflicts that were still deeply raw. And massive productions like The Pebbles and Battle of Britain proved that even near hits could feel like disasters when the budgets were sky high. The funny thing is, many of these so-called flops are more interesting to talk about today than some of the safe, successful war movies of the same decade. They took risks. They pushed boundaries. They misread the room, but in doing so, they helped nudge the war genre towards something more reflective and less comfortable. So the next time you hear someone dismiss a vintage war movie as a failure, it might be worth asking, failed for who and when? Because from where we're standing now, some of these lost battles look a lot like long-term victories for storytelling, and if you've seen any of these films, or if you're planning to check them out after this, let me know which one you think deserved better than the flop label.